The same guy was reporting in detail what was happening in this area in the north, but nobody, the BBC, the newspapers, nobody else has much interest did in this other massacre and, ethnic cleansing that was taking place. And often this is quite shameless, this sort of selectivity of we report this massacre, but we don't report
that one, right.
Similarly, I remember the Iraqi army in 2014 had suddenly, against a quite limited attack by Islamic State, the Iraqi army was far better armed and more numerous, and suddenly, bang, the Islamic State took Mosul, big city in northern Iraq, and was advancing on Baghdad. So armies can suddenly just sort of fall apart like that.
Welcome to the Cassandra Voices podcast, an Irish home for independent journalism with a global perspective. The prophetess Cassandra advised her fellow Trojans to reject the horse the Greeks had seemingly left behind as a gift, but was ignored. Our Cassandra Voices podcast offers cautionary tales and inspiring narratives to illuminate our own troubled times. We'll be putting out regular episodes reflecting the broad scope of our magazine's coverage over the last 6 years. Thanks to the Loafing Heroes and especially Bartholomew Ryan for the use of their track Rogoira from the 2019 album Meander Tales.
Patrick Cockburn.
Hello, glad to be with you.
Patrick, 13 years ago, you were writing for The Independent around the time of the start of the Syrian civil war. You reported from the Christian town of Malula that was northwest of Damascus. You wrote, "The omens are not good. Every country in the Middle East seems to be becoming more Islamic and more sectarian." In that piece, you spoke with the Mother Superior Pelagia Sayaf of the Orthodox convent of St. Tikla, which was raising Christian orphans from across the region. "Why are Europeans aiding people who kill with the knife?" she asked. So the piece goes on to end, "So far the sufferings of the Christians of Syria are no worse than those of the Muslims, but they feel that whatever the outcome of the civil war, their future will most likely be worse than their past."
Yep, that turned out to be all too correct, I'm afraid. I was talking to somebody who's from Malula, which is a Christian town, village, about an hour's drive north of Damascus, just off the main road today, and he was saying that the local people there are very frightened. They're trying to sort of keep a low profile. But earlier in the week there was a statue of a saint, of a Christian saint, that had been taken away by the government forces, and they'd been telling the local people not to react. They thought it was sort of a provocation to get them to react, and then they might be killed or kidnapped. So there's an atmosphere of fear. In Damascus, the same person who is a Christian was telling me that a lot of the sheikhs in the mosques, who were sort of moderate Sunni sort of leaders of local mosques, are being replaced by much more fanatical ones from Idlib in the north, where the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, who are effectively the new governing elite, come from. They say that everybody's that this person was saying that everybody, certainly all the Christians, were frightened. The Alawites are frightened. He said the secular Sunni were also frightened. There's probably those who, I'm sure there are those who support the new government, but I think it's important to stress, but it doesn't quite come across in the media coverage of what's happening in Damascus, that there are an awful lot of frightened people there, and they've got a lot to be frightened of.
To what extent is there, with those incoming forces of government, and I suppose of sectarian threat, to what extent is there an attitude that, say, the Christians and others might be kind of contaminated by the previous elite status or perceived elite status of the Alawites?
Well, they would think that way, and it's true Syria is a very sort of sectarian, is divided, between a Sunni Arab majority and sectarian ethnic minorities. The Assad government came from the Alawites, which are a sort of heterodox Shia sect. They were only really sort of accepted as Muslims quite sort of late on, but they come mostly from the coastal. They used to come from the coastal area on the Mediterranean, cities like Latakia and Tartus, and the mountains above the coast. And then they were sort of made up by half the population of Homs, which is a big city going north from Damascus, and there are a lot of them in Damascus. Then they did make up the former elite for about 50 years. But it's also true the other minorities sort of supported the government because they were frightened of the Sunni, particularly those from the country, which would mean the Christians. It could mean some of the Druze. It could mean the Kurds also didn't much like the government, but they're also very frightened of the of sort of Islamist fanatics who they've fought before. So I think that it was a picture that people didn't really get in 2011. When you had the Arab Spring, initially you had, a broad range of people rising up and protesting against an authoritarian government. But frankly, it didn't last very long. Once the shooting had started, and some people think that's one of the reasons why the government, began shooting quite early, then, the sectarian divisions became predominant in a way which I think the media never caught up with, or so rather deliberately brushed over. And you could see that in Damascus, that you'd see, I have a sort of picture in my mind of a sort of Sunni area being, turned into rubble by government artillery, and right beside it, some blocks of flats occupied by Alawites, which are completely untouched.
Right.
And so it was very sectarian. It's like, it's a bit like Belfast is that, that there are very very clear sectarian boundaries that everybody in the city knows, within an inch where they were, except it's more complicated because there are Alawites, there are Druze, there are Christians, there are Sunni, there are different types of Sunni. And of course, even by Belfast standards, a great deal more violent. A great many more people have been killed. That's a great part of what's been happening in Syria since over the last 13 years, and which has ruined a lot of the country. And the fear always was, certainly my fear, that if the other side won, the government, the Alawite, massacred, killed a lot of people, in prison, tortured a lot of people, forced millions out of the country, but if they fail, then the same thing happens to them. But as often with that sort of massacre, tit for tat massacres, the people who actually suffer from the revenge attacks are not actually the people who carried out, the original attacks.
Of course, yeah.
If I could move on, I was talking just a couple of hours ago to a woman from a village outside Latakia, which is a town on the coast. A lot of Alawites there. She was an Alawite. She said sort of forces had come in and had just told everybody to sort of stay in their homes, gone from house to house, killing the Alawites. She'd survived because she and her sister, they both have a couple of children, had before the forces got to them, had a Sunni neighbor had come and said, I'll hide you, and had hidden them, her and her sister in his house. And she'd survived. But she said the guys coming in, not only they killed a lot of people, they wouldn't let the families bury the dead for 3 days. And, I think officially, over 1,000 people have been massacred. But I think from what I was listening to, the real figure, we don't know what the real figure is, but I fear it's a great deal worse.
It's higher, yeah. Was this inevitable, do you think? It seems like there's very little in the way to stop this happening, and not very much rhetoric or action coming out of Damascus with the new government to stop it.
First of all, this was an Islamist government. They do come out of, HTS does come out of Jabal al-Nusra, which came out, was originally part of the Islamic State, I mean, these guys are Islamists, they don't just sort of, obviously it was in their interest to play that down in recent years, but it is true, they don't just sort of make it up. And, they're highly intolerant of other Muslim sects and of non-Muslim sects.
Yeah.
I think there's a tendency to sort of brush over this because it's sort of Assad was anti-West, therefore everything was attributed, a bit like Saddam in Iraq. Anything wrong with Iraq was blamed on Saddam. He was a pretty bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
But he was a symptom as well as a cause of what was bad with Iraq, as we discovered after he went. When even more people, when there were tremendous massacres in Baghdad and elsewhere, and, intense fighting, incredible destruction. Similarly, in Syria, what we're saying is a similar thing. Assad, very bad, murdered, tortured a lot of people, but he was also a symptom and of a dire situation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So, I think what I always felt during the years that, the thing was to try and bring this terrible conflict to an end. In a sort of satisfactory way, recognizing that, nobody had a monopoly of justice or a monopoly of injustice, that you needed to set up a system that was acceptable to all sides, which didn't mean they were ever going to like each other very much, but that they could live with, and that didn't happen. The outside states, each all had their proxies in Syria, the Americans, the Iranians, everybody else. They always were stoking the fires.
It looks also like that this Islamist wave contains all the elements of fragmentation, of rivalry, of warlordism, chaos. Certain traces of that seem to be there, as if that they're not acting like as one disciplined group.
Yeah, that is, the central government is trying to sort of assert control, but what exactly is the central government? How sectarian
what is it? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How far do they want to set control? Then they're acting under great pressures. That one of the aspect of this that of what has happened is that Syria as a nation state has sort of ceased to exist.
Yeah,
and what happens there is very much influenced, controlled by the two regional powers. Israel to the south is pushed further into the Golan Heights, has I think said that Syria must have no military forces south of Damascus. The Turks in the north have taken over enclaves. They partly sponsor the present government in Damascus. The Americans controlled and use their air force in the northeast in alliance with the Kurds. So there's fragmentation and continual friction and between all these factions. But I think, what one's also seeing is Syria ceasing to exist as a nation state, as other Arab nation states have ceased, to exist. Libya for one, Sudan for another, to a substantial degree Iraq, somewhat come back, but and is held together by oil money, but is very sort of battered. So, you used to have a sort of Arab world in that area, and you've lived in Lebanon, but in a sense, the whole area has been sort of Lebanized, if that's the right word, fragmented.
It was an interesting development. Now, if I remember correctly, I saw it quoted from Netanyahu to say that if the Druze come under bombardment, that they'll intervene to protect them. And attached to this kind of rhetoric, these ideas, is an emerging idea of some kind of Druze pseudo-state, which is interesting.
Yeah, I think they'll poke the fires, and everybody will have their proxies, notably Israel. They also use their air force to really permanently cripple Syria as a nation state, with an army with sort of self-determination and so forth. It gets kind of striking that I think in the last few months that the way the sort of Western governments and Western media have sort of very largely lost interest in what's happening in Syria. despite these terrible massacres.
That's right.
They will get worse.
Yeah, is there anyone left to protect the Alawites at all,
No,
or is it no?
I don't think so. I mean, who's going to do that? They don't have any. Their outside link was with fundamentally with Iran, and with the sort of so-called axis of resistance, which was really apart from the Hamas itself, which is Sunni, but the others was really a sort of a Shia international, if you like.
Yeah.
It was powerful in the states that had Shia pluralities or majorities or powerful minorities, which was Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. And in Syria and Lebanon, Lebanon obviously Hezbollah, the great Shia militia has been severely weakened.
Yes.
And the Alawite government has been defeated. So there isn't anybody really to protect them, or even notice what's happening to them.
Is it worth noting that of course not every member of that community was raised up into a completely elite status by the fact of the government being run by them?
These were villagers, They used to complain that the sort of Alawite elite, there wasn't much trickle down from the center. But of course, as often happens in that sort of situation, that doesn't mean they aren't going to be blamed. I remember seeing this after the fall of Saddam in Baghdad, when the sectarian war got going, every Sunni was treated as if they'd been a sort of intelligence officer in the Ba'ath Party. They all became vulnerable. And also, you other things. People, they want. First of all, people want their jobs. If you had the government jobs that were all monopolized by the Alawites, then people want those jobs. A lot of the Alawite community, about 2 million of them, most of them work for the government in some respect. So they're out of a job. Somebody's got their job, but it goes further than that. Somebody may want your house. Somebody may want your car. Somebody, may want your furniture.
This is
going.
Yes, absolutely. There's reports I've seen coming out of people being murdered for their businesses, for their assets, under the guise of this sectarian punishment or part of it, walking up with whatever people have. And
it's and there isn't and it'll probably get considerably worse. You get, and it begins to dominate everything. It's what in Belfast or Northern Ireland people used to call, the politics of the last atrocity.
Yes,
everybody's retaliating for something else.
Yeah.
But you have a government that hasn't got a monopoly of force, but it's got a superiority of force.
Yeah,
there's much the minorities can do about this.
It's a slightly bigger cudgel, and if it's possible to see also, as you got maybe in the stages of the Lebanese civil war, so much splintering and fragmentation that the groups start infighting. They also start very surprising allegiances. I mean, the scenario you just described is almost nudging the Alawites and the Christians together. It's like people are coming to raid the now vulnerable minority.
You have a lot of the Christians have left, but it's
they left. Yeah,
leave,
okay. Yeah, right.
I know somebody here in England who was trying to get his parents out, who was wondering how to get them across the Lebanese border, and this is quite a well-off guy,
Will they end up simply entering the Mediterranean from places like Latakia or the Lebanese
just
border?
Get in a boat. Why do you go there? You need you just get in a boat. You need to land somewhere. And I think that thinking back over the years, and I was sort of in Damascus in 2011, and backwards and forwards, to Syria afterwards. It's a terrible tragedy. I love Damascus, wonderful city. I like the rest of it. And, it's now sort of been ruined. And I think sort of ruined for a century, it's sort of, now you go to Damascus, you suddenly have whole areas that have been completely sort of devastated. Are people, there are 6 million Syrian refugees. Are they going to come back?
Right.
Well, I said this to one guy in Damascus recently. He just sort of laughed and said, you expect these people to come back to a country, which is, there's fighting, there's massacres. It's under sort of attack from Israeli aircraft. We've got the Turks coming from the north. We've got Islamic State in the east. We've got, the Kurds, the Americans, everybody else. Do you really think that they're all going to come racing back from Germany or, wherever else they've taken refuge to a place which is, which is such a nightmare? And so the answer is they won't unless they're forced.
No.
So I think that's the situation. I think it also, I think that it's always been a difficult as a journalist place to report because it's genuinely complex. It's sectarian politics and but also with groups, proxies for outside powers. Also, this sort of journalistic thing of seeing things in black and white, So people talk about sort of fake facts and so forth. It wasn't like, because, it's perfectly true that the Assad regime was pretty terrible. But I think what cripples journalism is good journalism or reporting what's really happening is that it was highly, it diluted the complexity of what was going on. Okay, inevitable, but it also was immensely selective, which means that, I remember at one point I was up in northern Syria, and at the same time the Syrian government was trying to attack an area called Douma in the east of Damascus, and was killing a lot of people. This was getting enormous publicity. Governments were outraged. At the very same moment, the Turks had moved into a Kurdish area called Afrin, right up on the north, and were driving people out. They were using Islamist militias. It was very easy. There was no mystery about this, because these Islamist militias were very happily videoed them. You took videos on their phones of them sort of intimidating and attacking, individual Kurds and so forth. So, it was there was nothing secret about this.
Right.
It was very difficult to get it into the paper. I remember talking to the head of an organization called the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is based in England, which was reporting what was happening in Douma, because sort of main civil rights, was had a very good network. And the same guy was reporting in detail what was happening in this area in the north, but nobody, the BBC, the newspapers, nobody else has much interest did in this other massacre and, ethnic cleansing that was taking place. And often this is quite shameless, this sort of selectivity of we report this massacre, but we don't report
not that one, right?
Because it doesn't fit in with our picture of, Assad is a real baddie. And the opposition is somehow being all sort of moderate social democrats.
Oh my God, no. So just finally, do you, within this mix of this murky, chaotic outcome now that we're looking at, do you think places like a Druze state or a Kurdish enclave or pseudo state could end up in positions of actual strength, or are they doomed to be kind of weakened by the outside, more powerful actors that won't want them to establish beachheads within the kind of rules? I think both those things are true.
Both those things are true. I think that you'll have sort of you might have some sort of Druze, local guys who want to take over, or maybe they just want to survive,
Right.
Communities just want to stay alive, So you look whatever protector you can, and that may change. You don't really have much choice. The Kurds in the north have suddenly signed an agreement with the Damascus government that they're going to, the Kurdish forces are going to join the Syrian armed forces. But since Syria has an army at the moment, there's nothing much to join, So how it changes is a very different question.
Right.
So you'll be like that. But then that sort of thing ebbs and flows with the foreign protectors and the local proxies, may be powerful at one moment. And then either they begin to lose out locally or the interests of their sponsor change. So at one moment they're powerful, next moment they're not. But they're always in friction with other communities. And that friction takes the form of sort of sporadic fighting and massacres and so forth. So it's not a happy prospect.
No, I'm also wondering, to what extent does Jelani and the HTS and all the rest, do they have to sort of sell to their hardcore, as it were, base? But these are simply their co-religionists with similar outlook around the world and so on. They don't want to create an ISIS Islamic State sequel.
Not quite, no. But that. First of all, it's not just them, it's people have told me, that in Sunni cities in Aleppo and Homs, in Hama, and in Homs is about half Alawite and half Sunni. The Sunni have been in the streets, sort of calling to kill the Alawites and so forth.
Yeah,
somebody sent me a video of a sort of small child with a knife saying, kill the Alawites.
And some disturbing stuff from Europe as well has popped up and been flagged and shared with good reason. It's so bizarre. These are actually Sunni refugees, Syrians residents in Europe, saying, do whatever you want with the Alawites, but just don't record it and don't upload it. I mean, there have been a few of those.
From the woman one woman I was talking to outside Latakia.
Yeah,
that they'd heard that the locals had been told by the sort of government general intelligence, if you do anything, make sure you don't take pictures of it or, put it online or anything like that.
Yeah.
So I think that's the shape of things. It will still come out, and it will still be there. But so many people do record things on their phones. But my experience in the past in Syria is that you have this very sort of culpable sort of selectivity as to which massacres the sort of the outside world wants to pay attention to and give great publicity to, and which it just wants to ignore.
And which
the current massacre seems to be one they want to ignore.
It's dreadful. I mean, I in conversation trying to maybe help people understand who are curious that don't know a hell of a lot, but there's this perception around the edges that all the Alawites basically are proximate or highly loyal to Assad. They are besieged, but they supported the entire thing, and that they're not, incorrectly targeted as being their allies and so on.
It's easy. You would say that on some BBC. You see quite some reputable reporters who don't seem to have made much effort to go to the places where the massacres are taking place. Saying, you could say truthfully, a lot of the the security forces of the Assad regime were Alawites. But these are sort of women and children and others and old men who are being killed, were not. The easiest people to kill are those who were not doing anything of the sort. Even if they were, it's this sort of mass slaughter is is this sort of lynch law. Shouldn't be justified or explained away by anybody.
It's not the relationship, not to get into it too deep, but the relationship between now relatively uncensored social media and what can appear there, and then what gets kind of ratified as some version of official fact in the mainstream news private channels and kind of national media and so on is kind of remarkable. Things happen fast. And you see only the tiniest glimpse of it. You might see on Telegram or X or whatever, clear, obvious first-person footage of all kinds of massacres by the victims or the killers. And then you read a couple of days, day 2 later, and you see unconfirmed reports or, and interpretations that militarize the whole thing and see it as the context of a battle with a few kind of accidental deaths on the side.
Yeah, you can. You need big organizations to sort of, with credibility, to put this out and keep putting it out. These don't have the credibility they had. There's been a certain sort of, I'm afraid, because of the internet taking away the financial basis for a lot of newspapers, you have a sort of de-skilling of journalism.
Yep.
And not just de-skilling, where you used to have, large offices in, Beirut or somewhere else. You don't anymore.
Yeah.
I don't want to be too gloomy because, in some ways, it's positive that these things are, people take pictures of these things on their phones. They can record it. This wasn't true 40 years ago.
Sure.
That there were massacres that would take place, that you'd have, somebody who might eventually go and collect it, eyewitnesses, but there wasn't contemporary pictures of as we have now, and that is a positive. One can then go on to say, well, it's the mainline. A lot of the media just ignores this because it doesn't fit in with their political stereotypes or bias. But it is there that more can be done. And hideous though, horrible though all the things that have happened in Gaza, we all know about it. You go on to say, well, it hasn't done the people there a lot of good since they're still being massacred, but it, I don't think one should be sort of gloomy across the board about the way these developments are reported.
What you are listening to has taken time and resources to prepare. It is a collaboration of committed journalists. Please, if you can, share, subscribe, or support this podcast in whatever way you can.
Let's move on, if we can, to Ukraine and Europe in particular. So, writing earlier this month for the iPaper you wrote, is, for instance, the purpose of Starmer's much vaunted coalition of the willing largely to boost the idea that the UK, France, and their allies are serious players in what may be the endgame of the Ukraine war, or does it have a more serious purpose? Is it really intended to send soldiers from NATO countries into Ukraine?
Yes, it's rather extraordinary that Starmer keeps going on about the coalition of the willing, but never says what they should be willing to do. The one thing we know is that they're willing to join a coalition, but for what purpose? The original coalition of the willing was people who were willing to join the US in invading Iraq in 2003, which didn't work out too well. But are they really intending to send troops to Ukraine? Something 100% ruled out by the Russians, who say they'll treat any sort of troops from a NATO country just like they would the Ukrainian troops. In other words, they'll attack them. The Americans have said they won't guarantee to support them militarily. So is this just sort of boosterism on the part of Starmer and Macron? Or do they intend to do something quite so mad as to send troops unilaterally? Then the idea would be there would be a sort of tripwire. If the Russians came, there would be sort of greater NATO intervention. But if the Americans do nothing, then, they're sort of at war with Russia in an inferior position. So it's really pretty bizarre as a policy. They keep on having conferences to discuss this and move to the operational phase, according to Starmer. But phase of what? I mean, phase towards going into Ukraine. It really doesn't make any sense.
And you speak of this phenomenon of threat inflation, of the kind of narrative, sort of self-owning, paradoxical behavior, how Western governments, media, and PR firms have crafted a picture of this is you writing the Ukraine war as essentially a rerun of World War II, with President Putin and Russia as modern versions of Hitler and Nazi Germany seeking to conquer Ukraine and sweep on into Central Europe. And anyone doubting it is an appeaser, which makes people supporting it, Churchillian and heroic. And if they have tried to paint the world this way, then it means that they feel that they can't back down. And yet it assumes, what audience does this assume? Who's all the boosterism for? Who wants to go and fight for Keir Starmer and for Ursula von der Leyen or for Emmanuel Macron against Russia?
Yeah. Yes, it's sort of. They can't sort of think what to do. I think they've been so used to being sort of having a sort of vassal status as regards the Washington, that when they don't have Washington, they sort of don't really know what to do themselves. Mm-hmm. As regards, and also, the threat inflation. Russia has, its initial invasion was a fiasco. It couldn't get down the road to Kharkiv. There was an enormous traffic jam. It failed to take even any of the major cities in the north. Yet somehow Russia is at one time a very sort of puny military force, and that the Ukrainians might defeat. Which is what Biden and the Europeans were trying to do previously, but at the same time is a terrible menace who might sort of advance from a defeated Ukraine into Poland and into Central Europe, just like the sort of Red Army under Stalin in 1945. Mm-hmm. And these two things are in complete contradiction, but somehow it's not commented on very much. I think one of the depressing things about Ukraine is that government policy can be that European EU policy, government policy in the West European states can be so contradictory, and there's very little criticism from the media or the talking heads or the intelligentsia.
Mm-hmm. So this article of yours, Peter Hitchens picked up on it, and just the way he's been speaking has a number of echoes, and he's able to bring in history well, I think. In one interview for a Slovakian magazine, it seems, he completed a paragraph saying, "The whole of the Western world has been told things about Ukraine which make it very difficult for a compromised peace." I think this echoes what you're saying, but it is still puzzling as to how precisely this has come about, and why there doesn't seem to be very strong countervailing voices in many important.
Yeah, it's I find it sort of pretty amazing that it's portrayed as all this began with Russia invading. That, I mean, you can against the Russian invasion. I think it was a disastrous decision, but at the same time, there's no doubt that the Russians did feel threatened by the advance of NATO eastwards. Mm-hmm. So the provocation was there. That doesn't justify the way they responded to it. And if there was provocation, then they shouldn't have been allow themselves to be provoked. Mm-hmm. But I think just painting this all in sort of black and white, total demonization of Russia and Putin, treated as a pariah, everything which the Ukrainians say is immediately accepted, including battlefield accounts. On the one hand, Russia is meant to be sort of this great monster advancing west, but on the other hand, it seems to be, endless sort of battlefield stuff, saying, they're suffering gigantic casualties and, this has ebbed a bit, but, demoralized and everything else. This is very much straight out of the First World War, the sort of stuff that was produced then with Putin instead of the German Kaiser as the great demon.
And they are fighting in trenches.
Yeah, it's kind of similar in many ways. The Russians seem to have been trying to sort of bleed the Ukrainians by inflicting heavy casualties on a country that has a population that is a fifth of that of Russia. Very much was what the Germans tried to do to the French at the Battle of Verdun. I think about 600,000 Germans and French were killed or wounded, and there's about 1 million Russians and Ukrainians have been killed. But at least in both cases, there's been a bloodbath.
You're at the end of your piece. You quote a speech from Clemenceau at Verdun in 1919. So after the war is over, saying that it's easier to make war than to make peace. And you add that European leaders are still not thinking seriously enough about how that peace should be made.
Yeah, I mean, they denounced Trump for, seeking to make a peace, but they don't actually explain what they themselves would do. They say, we will strengthen Ukraine. For what purpose is that to prevent the collapse of Ukraine? Well, that's not unreasonable. But, what is their longer term policy? Do they still adhere to the idea that Russians can be pushed out of Crimea and Donbass, something the Americans just say can't be done, everybody admits can't be done? Do they say that as British politicians do, that Ukraine must decide what the future is? But there's a war, so obviously there has to be a negotiated settlement if neither side is going to win it. So it's curious and rather sort of menacing that European politicians, and particularly British politicians, have disappeared into this sort of world of make-believe and wishful thinking. And it's also dangerous because I think they believe a lot of their own propaganda.
Right. I wonder if you could zoom in on some of the battlefield, the way it looks now. There's a kind of fuzzy, I won't call it a ceasefire or a stalemate. Don't quite know what the word is, but as diplomacy at various very high levels seems to be going on, there's something of a pause in fighting. And maybe you could home in on...
Well, the Russians, I mean, you have a sort of stalemate and neither side is advancing along most of the front. The Russians are pushing forward. Both sides seem to be suffering heavy casualties. I mean, the battle which people have been focusing on is in Kursk, the bit of Russian territory which the Ukrainians took by surprise last August. And the Russians seem to have pushed them out of most of it. And then there's this sort of a rather weird controversy as to whether or not the Russians have surrounded 2,500 Ukrainian troops, as Trump says.
Yes.
And Zelensky and the Ukrainians deny. I mean, Kursk is interesting because it was never quite clear when the Ukrainians took over a chunk. Now, they may have been aiming, there's a big power station at Kursk, power station, which they didn't get to. But they were then in a quite sort of narrow salient. Now, was it that the Russians simply didn't have the reinforcements to drive them out and let it lie? Or was it that the Ukrainians had used their best units there and they were in a rather a salient difficult to defend. So the Russians thought, well, that's good for us. We'll keep bombarding them, causing them heavy casualties among their best troops. But then we get, when a ceasefire, might or might not happen, probably won't, but let's say it does, the Russians probably calculate that the new line, whatever a ceasefire line, could end up by hardening into the dividing line between Russia and Ukraine, rather like in the line in Korea, which has been there for decades.
Yes.
Since 1953, with this demilitarized zone. So that could happen there, but they don't want that line to be running through Russian territory. And probably that would be sort of very bad news among Russian public opinion, which still sort of counts for something, even in a state as authoritarian as Putin's.
Yeah, I think some people have predicted that the conflict would simply freeze. That is the term for it, as with the Koreas. No peace agreement, no agreement on territory, just an end to open hostility, and then a heavily militarized border. Then the idea that maybe the Russian idea is wintering out history for years, remilitarizing or building up, the military and the army, and just going forward again.
Well, they're in a fairly, they probably calculate they're in a fairly good position now, that they've getting, they're not breaking through, but, it's generally admitted, and Trump keeps saying that, and presumably draws on American intelligence. Though, Trump is pretty crazy, so we don't know, but it assuming that he and Vance do get this intelligence, that keeps on saying, the Russians have the cards, have the military cards. So that's probably the case. But they're not, their original invasion was a fiasco in 3 years ago. And now they're looking stronger. They've sort of held off Ukraine, backed with all these Western weapons. But they're not in a position to conquer Ukraine, to subjugate Ukraine. But I think that there is a sense, the Ukrainian front line could break. The head of that military and intelligence, who's a general called Budanov, told, this was publicized in Ukraine, told a secret session of the Ukrainian parliament that there was a danger that the Ukrainian front line might simply disintegrate. That's not proof positive, but that is the head of their military intelligence.
That's through mutiny or demoralization, or
I think he didn't say, but I don't think a mutiny, but that they're just overwhelmed, that they don't have enough troops, they can't. Others say they're demoralized. Again, that's difficult to tell, and a lot of the media coverage of Ukrainian troops, well, whenever foreign media comes to see people in the front line, this is very heavily monitored by the Ukrainians, or by anybody who has a front line. So you're not going to have, troops are all going to say, hurrah, hurrah, we're not this to the end, and so forth. But there's general agreement that they're very short of troops and can't replace casualties. And there's always a danger that an army will suddenly disintegrate. I mean, I've seen this in Iraq and elsewhere, that a sudden moment that people think, well, I'm not going to be the last person to die in this war, and I'll take off home. So that's a danger. It doesn't mean it's going to happen, but it's obviously one potential factor. Okay.
Do you think the Syrian regime collapse had something of that character to it?
I think so, yes. It's still a bit mysterious, because they were fighting, a quite small force, as to why they suddenly went down like a pack of cards. But they did. And then, a bit like, another example might be the Afghan army when that collapsed. in the face of the Taliban, that suddenly, quite a well-equipped army that suddenly didn't have American support, but still was much better armed and more numerous than the Taliban, suddenly went down like ninepins. Similarly, I remember the Iraqi army in 2014 had suddenly, against a quite limited attack by Islamic State, the Iraqi army was far better armed and more numerous, and suddenly, bang, the Islamic State took Mosul, big city in northern Iraq, and was advancing on Baghdad. So armies can suddenly just sort of fall apart like that. Of course, they're held apart together by discipline, and then suddenly that goes, and everybody's off home.
Yeah, speaking of that nature of morale, of why and how people are given cause to fight, it seems like the Europeans and von der Leyen have just adopted almost kind of universal ostrich kind of strategy, wishful thinking, to bring it back to Syria. Von der Leyen was speaking this week at the 9th Brussels conference on Syria. So that's not, of course, the entire length of the Syrian civil war, which probably began in 2011. But still, that's quite a few Brussels conferences on Syria. That's a decade's worth. And considering what we spoke about earlier in the conversation, I find her comments to be extraordinary. She says, the agreement between the central authorities and the Kurdish SDF is nothing short of historic, as is the signing of a constitutional declaration by interim President al-Shara. So great, he's made a declaration. On the other hand, the attacks on security forces, so that's what she prioritizes, and the violence against civilians in Syria's coastal region show that the situation remains fragile. The Syrian authorities' commitment to bring the perpetrators to justice, to protect minorities, and form an inclusive government. All of this is vital for reconciliation. I think this is out of touch with reality in about 7.
Yeah, it's a curious thing about the EU and von der Leyen. In Ukraine and Syria, in Gaza, they have policies about about these great big issues that just not based on reality. In Syria, they the government probably controls at most about 50% of the territory. You have the Israelis in the south, you have the Turks in the north, you have the Kurds in the northeast, and so forth. So they control very little, and they so what are they? The idea that they're going to sort of move into Kurdistan, this is really sort of fantasy. And the Kurds will talk about it. They have quite a sort of well-organized government there. I mean, there are other things that could happen because the Kurds also control large areas that are populated by Arabs, but it's basically a sort of fantasy. And also, the government in Damascus, it is an Islamist government. I mean, some time back, I was in touch with a former Islamic State guy, and who'd had some quarrel with them. I was in contact online, and he was saying, well, of course, that this between ISIS, Islamic State, and the other Islamist groups, they sort of move backwards and forwards. If the Islamic State suddenly joins up with the other Islamist groups, they just sort of shave off their beards. But so this idea of von der Leyen that this is a constitution that guarantees minorities. I mean, I was talking to Alawites in outside Latakia, whose villages just been destroyed and people massacred. And again, I was talking to Christians in Damascus, and the Christians are getting out. They're in flight if they can get out of the country.
Where would they go? Can they get on planes and go to Lebanon or Cyprus?
No, but so how do you get in? How do you get out of the country? How do you get in somewhere else? You won't exactly be welcomed with open arms. No. Somebody rang me up the other day. I was Christian asking, how could he get his mother and father across the Lebanese border? I mean, I don't know the answer, but so it's fantasy there. But also in Gaza, these European politicians going on about the two-state solution. People, Palestinians in Gaza, are being killed by the hundreds. It's a measure of somehow, to an extraordinary degree, the EU and the European NATO heads of state, with a few exceptions, just don't seem to have been able to devise policies of their own, which are separate from those of the US. But all these, and often what they propose is infantile or contradictory. But all these people, have diplomatic services, they have intelligence services. It's rather extraordinary the way they're sort of running around like chickens with their heads cut off.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's a lot of ample comment. And if possible, we would like to speak to you again if any of these situations change radically and you keep writing about them. How does that sound?
No, I'd be delighted at any time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Cassandra Voices is a multimedia project that seeks to highlight independent voices and inspire original thinking with stories from Ireland and around the world. Go to CassandraVoices.com online to read more and look out for more episodes from us in future. Your attention and your support are crucial. Thank you.